Welcome to Science Fiction 101, the podcast series where we explore the science fiction field from all angles, covering the past, the present, and the future. We're your hosts. I'm Phil.
And I'm Colin.
And welcome to our fourth episode. We're going to have to stop counting them after this point because I'll get it wrong. I just know it, but I'm counting up to now. Welcome to our fourth episode, where we will be talking about all sorts of things, but especially about X-science fiction. All will become clear later, I hope. But first, some news. The Locus Award shortlist is out. Locus is the leading and possibly the only science fiction news magazine, and they focus almost entirely on books and stories, so there's no films, TV or computer games or anything like that in the Locus Awards. They also have a broader range of categories than some of the other awards, and they make a distinct separation of science fiction, fantasy and horror in some categories. Now, personally, I don't mind things bleeding over from one genre to another, but I think when you use awards as a way of sort of testing the temperature of reactions to the field, it's useful to have separate awards for separate fields in some ways. And some of the authors that we've mentioned before on the show have been nominated or shortlisted in the Locus Awards. Mary Robinette Kowal is there for the novel The Relentless Moon. John Scalzi is there for the novel The Last Emperox. And as usual, there's a lot on their shortlist that I haven't read because I'm not current, I'm not up to date. But the non-fiction category includes a couple that I am familiar with. There's First Fandom's The Visual History of Science Fiction Fandom Volume 1, the 1930s, which is a really nice archive-based collection of documents and commentary. It's a really nice piece. And my good friend Jonathan R. Eller has his final biographical volume on Ray Bradbury on the shortlist. That's Bradbury Beyond Apollo. So it's really nice to see that. I doubt that that book has a wide enough readership to win, but it's good to see it being recognised at least on a shortlist.
Yes, definitely.
Are you familiar with any of the other items on the list?
I read John Scalzi and Mary Robinette Kowal pretty frequently.
Yeah.
I definitely recognized some of the short stories from the Hugos and the Nebula shortlists.
Yeah.
And I recognize some of the other author names. I like that. So I mentioned in one of our earlier podcasts that I really enjoyed going to a library and getting books. And before I went to libraries to get books, I went to bookstores. And it got to be where you would recognize, because this author would regularly put out new books, or they would always carry those books because they were very popular. So it's kind of nice to start recognizing author names again.
Even without reading them, I find that I become familiar with authors. I mean, I tend to see interviews with authors as well. And to be honest, I'm more likely to have read an interview with an author than I am to have read their book, simply because I've got such a backlog of books that I'm trying to work through anyway. Yeah, so it's good to see familiar names popping up. And as you say, there is some overlap with the Hugos and the Nebulas in terms of who is nominated. So that sort of reinforces the award worthiness of some items.
Oh, especially when there are such different judging criteria for each one. The Hugos is a popularity contest from the people going to the current World Science Fiction Convention.
Yeah.
The Nebulas is a more critical list, I would say, done by the members of the Science Fiction Writers Association. And then the Locus magazine is a completely different group. There's probably some overlap between the first two and the Locus people,
Sure.
but the idea that being nominated for one would guarantee you the other is certainly not guaranteed.
That's right. In our last episode, we talked about space as our sort of running theme, and I've got some feedback on that last episode, so I'd like to share that with you now. Timothy contacted us and said, in the latest podcast you mentioned a couple of examples of adapting humans to colonise other planets. That was the theme of the short stories in James Blish's 1957 collection, The Seedling Stars. Now, that was me that brought that up because I mentioned Man Plus by Fred Pohl, which is about adapting a human to be able to live on Mars under the native conditions of Mars. Timothy's absolutely right. The Seedling Stars does address a similar kind of thing. And I've read quite a bit of James Blish, not for a long time, but there was a time when I worked through most of his, oeuvre or canon. But I never read The Seedling Stars, so I've added that to my ever-growing list of things to read. So, but it's a short story collection, and I tend to devour those more readily than I devour novels. I think it's because I can sort of approach it in chunks.
It's a little more bite-size.
Yeah, that's right. But it reminded me that James Blish coined a term for this, for adapting people to fit a planet, and he called it pantropy, which I suppose is based on the word entropy. And I looked it up on Wikipedia and was quite surprised to see that there is a Wikipedia page for pantropy, and that has a list of plenty of other books and stories which run with the same basic idea. And Man Plus, which triggered this discussion in the first place, is listed there. And so is Olaf Stapledon's Last and First Men, which is another work that I know about because I've read it in the dim and distant past, but I'd completely forgotten that it had anything to do with this. So what this has taught me is, once again, what I assumed was just the subject matter of one book, i.e. Man Plus, actually turns out to be a whole subgenre of science fiction that everybody's dabbled in, basically.
Well, and as I mentioned, from our last episode, and when we were talking about this, the show on Netflix that I watch is called The Titan.
Yes.
So it actually doesn't involve Europa. It involves the moon, or the moon of Titan from Saturn.
Yeah.
It's still a thing people think about.
Yeah, yeah.
You can only go so far in isolating humans from our environment. At some point, from a science fiction standpoint, it kind of makes sense to change people to fit the environment instead of just putting them in a suit or a ship.
Exactly. And I can't think of any titles specifically, but I have read some stories where it's more a matter of long-term evolution. So, for instance, you take people into zero gravity and have a space station, and then they have offspring, and the offspring grow up entirely in zero gravity so that they are unable to return to the home planet because they literally don't have the body strength to do that. So you get a kind of slow evolution of humans. I can't remember who's written stuff about that. I'm sure Arthur C. Clarke probably has at some point. But
yeah, in his book, The Hammer of God, which I just read 2 weeks ago because I went on an Arthur C. Clarke reading kick. He talks about people that had a son on Mars, and the father goes off on a spaceship to do a mission, and he has to do his zero-G exercises so that he's allowed to eventually go home or eventually return to the Earth or the Moon.
Right, yes. This is one of the things that I wonder about with planned trips to Mars. And that is because it takes so long to get to Mars, people will have spent a long period in zero-G. And no matter how well exercised they are, they've then got to land on Mars all by themselves. There's not going to be anybody there to help them out of the spaceship at the other end. Like at the moment, you go to the ISS and you come back from the ISS, you may have spent a year there, but there will be people and doctors to meet you when you arrive back home and help you off the spaceship and learn how to walk again. But people going to Mars are going to have to do that all by themselves.
Not to jump around too much, but I'm anxiously waiting my copy of Andy Weir's new book to come.
Yes.
Project Hail Mary. And to help tide me over, I reread The Martian, which I think is probably close to the 10th or 11th time that I've read that book. And people sometimes fault the book because it misses the science of perchlorates in the soil, which would have prevented Mark from growing the potatoes to keep him alive long enough to get off the planet. But that's also a question that I think should be brought up is, when the astronauts initially landed on Mars, how long did it take them to acclimatize to 1/3 of an Earth gravity so that they could start their mission?
Yeah. And of course, our knowledge, we've probably said this before, but our knowledge of Mars and other places is in a constant state of flux. Presumably at the time he wrote it, Andy Weir didn't know about the perchlorates.
No, I think you're right. That was a chemical discovery made after the fact.
Yeah. So it's
hard to criticize a book for not covering something that we didn't know about at the time.
Exactly. And I think we'll come on to this, won't we, later on when we talk about ex-science fiction, which I think relates to this.
Definitely.
Good. Just to go back to feedback a little bit, on Facebook I posted a list of where our listeners hail from, just from, the download statistics on the podcast. Mm-hmm. And the humorous version that I posted showed that 100% of our listeners are on the planet Earth. We don't have any listeners on Mars or Mercury. But the less humorous version was a breakdown by country of where our listeners are. And as I've said before, most of our listeners are in the USA, and in second place is the UK. When I posted that on Facebook, a couple of listeners commented. One was Michael, who is in Western Australia, and another was Gary, who is in Tasmania. So that quite pleased me, because from where I'm sitting here in England, that's as far away as you can get.
Tasmania?
While still being on the planet. Well, Australia generally.
Yeah.
And then the last bit of feedback is sort of not so good feedback. I set a little competition last time with our mystery sound, but nobody guessed correctly what the sound was. So that was quite a shock, because I thought I had chosen a sound that every true science fiction fan would recognise, but times must have changed. I'm going to play the sound again, and then I'll talk about it a little bit. So here it is now. And Colin, listen carefully, because I'm going to ask you for your opinion on this.
Okay.
It goes on for about another 5 minutes in the film that it is from, because it is from a film. But we had a couple of guesses and speculations. Nobody was really willing to sort of put money on their guesses. But Michael said, I thought the mystery sound might be the first men using their bone tools to dig something up from 2001, A Space Odyssey. Either that or Bowman's cutlery on his plate from later in the same film. I think both of those are very intriguing speculations. Wrong, of course. And Michael knew that because he went and watched the film and couldn't find those sounds in there. So it's not that. He then said, I thought maybe the watch in Interstellar, but then he thought there was a lot of music over that, whereas the audio that I played had no music and was pretty crackly, which made him think that this was a much older sound, and that's true. And then his final sort of speculative talking was, well, it sounds like someone moving something that continually warps back to its original position, but I can't think what that would be. And Seth had a speculative moment. He said, I'll guess The Fly, 1950s, but can't come up with a specific scene. Sometime after he gets the fly head. So that's a very generic guess, and obviously no, that is not correct. So a lot of people speculated, but they knew they were wrong. So nobody had a real solid guess. So Colin, do you have a guess?
My guess was from 2001 as well.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to say it was the sound of Bowman opening the door manually when he was trapped outside and Hal wouldn't let him back in. But if Michael's watched the movie and didn't hear that sound, then that obviously can't be it.
No, that's right. Now, there is a sort of connection there. It's not 2001, it's Destination Moon from 1950. Which was the first, it's always called the first science fiction film to sort of realistically, in inverted commas, realistically portray a journey to the moon. And specifically what the sound is, this is the sound you make when you put on your magnetic boots and you walk around the inside of the metal rocket ship. You make that noise, apparently. I've seen it and heard it with my own eyes and ears. That's the sound you make. Now, I can't remember how old I was when I first saw Destination Moon. I would have seen it on the TV in probably the early 1970s. And Even as a young child, I thought to myself, why on earth would you want to wear magnetic boots to hold you down in a spaceship? This is in 0G.
Yes.
When you could float around, and it would be much more productive to float around. And this seems to be something that science fiction people mostly overlooked. They always wanted to give people magnetic boots. Even in 2001, the sort of air stewardess, she doesn't have magnetic boots, but she has Velcro boots so that she can walk along the aisle of the aircraft. And it would be far easier just to float. So I'm baffled. But anyway, that's what the sound was. It was magnetic boots. Now, I do have another mystery sound, so I'll play this one. It's of a similar genre to what we've just heard, but hopefully more people will recognise this. So what is this sound? So there's our mystery sound, and so, dear listener, if you would like to have a guess at the mystery sound, or get in touch with us about anything else in the podcast, you can leave a comment on our blog, which is 101sf.blogspot.com, or you can find us on Facebook. And while you're on Facebook, you can give us a like. Now, let's move on to today's theme, which is X science fiction. Colin, what are we talking about here?
Well, we've kind of talked around it a little bit, but as I've been reading a lot of the older science fiction, especially from Arthur C. Clarke, there's this idea that there were things that people thought were impossible and became in the realm of science fiction, and then due to human ingenuity, creativity, and technology, currently exist.
Right.
So I began to think, well, how many of those things are there? You can find television shows and documentaries talking about things that were inspired by Star Trek or Star Wars or other things. Yeah. But I hadn't ever thought about, from the whole body of science fiction, how many things have been brought into, science fact by our work.
Right. So what we're talking about is things that used to be science fiction, but now are just everyday reality.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can you give us some specific examples?
In the book by Arthur C. Clarke, Prelude to Space, landing on the moon was a dream. It hadn't happened yet.
Yeah.
And now we did it in 1969, and we did it for a few years after that, but we haven't done it in a while.
And how does it happen in Prelude to Space? Is it a single rocket that goes all the way to the moon, lands and comes back, or does he have a multi-stage vehicle?
It's a multi-stage vehicle.
Yeah.
Because of the problem of transmitting all that mass, or transporting all that mass from one place to another. Yeah. So a ship takes off, an atomic-powered ship takes off, and remains in orbit, and then a second ship transits out to the moon and down and back, and then comes back and then latches up to the original ship and lands back on the Earth.
Of course, that's similar to what happened with the Apollo program, and also what they're planning for Artemis, because the NASA announced a couple of weeks ago that they're giving the contract for building the lunar lander to SpaceX, and essentially SpaceX are just required to supply the bit that goes from lunar orbit down to the moon and then back up to lunar orbit again, so the lander section of it.
Mm-hmm. And that's another thing. Up until, I'm going to say, the last 10 years, space was pretty much the realm of governments.
Yeah.
But now we're seeing, international businesses take over some of this with satellite launches and now full rocket launches, like you mentioned, right? SpaceX will be the vendor for getting to the moon and back. Yeah. In Prelude to Space, a multinational was in charge of getting us off of the Earth and to the moon. It wasn't any one government.
Right. And does Clarke talk about how it's financed, or does he not go into that?
I believe it's a combination of individual investors who understand the development opportunities of going to the moon, and also national governments.
That's a pretty good speculation from the point that Clarke was at. Some of his contemporaries, notably Robert Heinlein, were writing in terms of private money sending people to the moon. Rich businessmen or rich companies sending people to the moon. But it sounds to me as if Clarke appreciated the enormity of what's required to get to the moon. And that's the thing that's always struck me, is the Apollo program was one of the most expensive things that humans have ever done. I think the only thing that comes close is the Manhattan Project to create the first atomic bomb. So Clark must have had that perception to think that multiple governments and corporations would need to club together to be able to do this. Did you ever, years and years ago, I think this was in the late 70s, see a TV show called Salvage One?
With Andy Griffith.
Yes.
I did.
That was fantastic. And that was a junkyard, a guy who just went there to get the junk off the moon, wasn't it? It was a salvage mission, hence the title. The theory was that the junk left on the moon was so valuable that if you could just bring it back, you'd make a killing from it.
Yeah. There's actually an amazing amount of junk that was left on the moon.
Oh, yeah.
One of the more famous artifacts left up on the moon are the golf balls hit by...
Alan Shepard.
Alan Shepard, thank you.
Yes. Have you got any other examples of ex-science fiction?
I do. I have a list of about 15 or 20 of them.
Whoa.
We don't need to go through them all.
Oh, please.
Oh, okay. For Dick Tracy and Star Trek, portable video and audio communications.
Right. Now that has always struck me as kind of obvious in the sense that it's just a logical extrapolation of the idea of what the telephone does. So that the way to perfect the telephone would be to make it visual as well as sound and portable. So that seems like a logical extrapolation. The weird thing is that for the longest time it was very difficult to get people in real life to have mobile phones. Why on earth would I want to be contacted when I'm away from my desk? But I think what turned that around was the discovery that you could contact other people whenever you wanted. So there turned out to be an advantage that people couldn't see. But yeah, what else have you got on the list?
From Star Trek, I picked one, the hypospray, the idea of needleless injection.
Right. And do we have that?
We do. Yeah, that's actually been around for about 15 years.
Oh, wow.
It's rather expensive.
Yeah.
Because we make lots of needles cheaply. But if you are afraid of needles, there are opportunities to get an injection without a needle.
Just got to make sure you don't accidentally inject yourself and then jump through a Guardian of Forever while under the influence of the psychotic drug or whatever it is that you've injected yourself with.
You could alter time accidentally. From the movies Demolition Man, Minority Report, and Total Recall, they all had self-driving cars.
Oh, wow. Yes. And we're on the cusp of that. I mean, we have the technology, but we don't. They're not really common in real life, are they, at this point?
No.
And do you think they ever will be?
Maybe yes, maybe no.
Yeah.
The problem I see with it is one of liability. Not a technological problem, because, yeah, you can teach a car how to drive and how to recognize things that are happening situationally. But at some point, there's an accident that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And normally in an accident, it's one driver versus another driver, road conditions, maintenance, many issues like that. But when you bring software and hardware into the picture, it seems odd that any manufacturer of autonomous cars would take on the liability for several 100 million people.
However, if you think about it, we have a similar thing in that a human driver is capable of doing untold damage. And the way we get around that is by the simple process of having insurance and making insurance compulsory. Mm-hmm. And so I can imagine that we could have a future where, yes, liability is almost impossible to establish, but everybody could just have a kind of a blanket insurance that says, yeah, okay, maybe it was our fault, but we don't know. But here's the insurance money that's going to pay for whatever damage has been done. There's the possibility that it could be safer than human drivers. And this is the bizarre thing. And yet, I still think we will find it very hard to accept when an autonomous car kills a human being. There might be a huge advantage to us having them because they might be safer than human drivers. And yet, the minute one of them kills somebody, the whole planet will turn against them.
Yep. Because we're humans and we tend to act that way sometimes.
We do. We're very judgmental. I guess that's why the 3 laws of robotics were invented as well.
You would hope it would have that hierarchy where the highest priority was to save human life.
Yeah.
And the second priority is to protect itself.
And to obey orders.
Yes, if you want to go to the donut shop, it doesn't take you down to the local barber shop instead.
Or vice versa.
Yes.
What else have you got on your list?
Actually, one from your neck of the woods.
Ooh.
In the comics and the movie The Rocketeer, there's a jetpacks. And just earlier this week, I read that the British Royal Marines jumped from an inflatable boat onto a second ship using jetpacks.
Wow.
To do a boarding exercise.
How far did they travel? Just like 50 meters or something?
I would say it was less than that.
Okay.
25 or 30 meters.
So very short range.
And they've had jetpacks you could wear that are like hydrodynamic, where they pump water up into the pack and then the pack shoots it down to give you lift. But this was completely freestanding. It was a guy with a jetpack.
Interesting. Any others on your list?
Yes. One of your favorite series, Star Trek, was mentioned in The Hammer of God by Arthur C. Clarke, where he predicted periodic Star Trek reboots. Now, he got 2 of them, I believe. The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. But then, of course, he missed Enterprise and the newest one, which is streaming from Paramount.
When did he publish that?
That one was in 1993. It was an interesting book. Tons of world building and backstory, and then the action happens down at the end.
I wonder what led him to put that in there as a speculation. Is it sort of done tongue-in-cheek?
Yes. So he would suspect that even hundreds of years in the future, that we will still be rebooting Star Trek.
Fantastic. Any others?
A couple. One another tongue-in-cheek one, and then one that's more serious. Mm-hmm. There is actually a food product called Soylent Green. I would presume it has a good source material rather than the content of the book. And then a little more serious, just because we've been dealing with space issues. Like right now, the world is under a watch because there's a piece of Russian or Chinese rocketry which is tumbling out of control and is going to re-enter the atmosphere sometime in the next 2 days with no control.
Ooh.
And it turns out that it travels over most of the landmass of North America and Asia as part of its regular flight path. There's a chance of an accident happening that's pretty catastrophic. But I brought that up because of Rendezvous with Rama, which talked about Space Guard and an asteroid watch in 1973. And we actually have a Space Guard organization now, which was named after that.
Excellent. So that sounds like a very specific influence. Some of these are sort of like the communicator from Star Trek seems like an inevitable piece of technology that even if Star Trek hadn't done it, we might still have had those in real life. Whereas what you're referring to there is something very specifically foreseen by Clarke, and it sounds like the actual thing, if it's been named after it, sounds like there's a direct influence.
Yeah, there's actually a pretty long-running and respected history of using science fiction people as advisors and think tanks for the government. Mm-hmm. The first thing that came to mind was Space Guard. The second thing that came to mind was Project Orion, which was the idea of a nuclear-powered spaceship that was powered by nuclear bombs.
I saw a documentary about that about a year ago, and if I remember correctly, that was put paid to by a nuclear proliferation treaty of some kind. One of the international treaties said you cannot explode an atomic bomb in space.
I believe you're right. Aside from the nasty problems of what happens if there's a problem at launch, it causes pollution issues with all the fallout.
Not the kind of thing you really want, is it?
No, we'll have to find some other way to propel ourselves into space.
Yeah, but it's amazing how much science fiction, I suppose post-war science fiction, talked about atomic engines and atomic rockets. It was just assumed that would be the technology that would get us places. But of course, in reality, we just used good old-fashioned chemicals and flames. to get where we wanted.
Yeah, we haven't invented a better way to get lots of mass off the planet yet.
Yeah. So the question is, if science fiction is putting forward these things and then they are coming true, what does that do to the science fiction? When you go back and look at, say, Prelude to Space, do you read it and, on the one hand, recognise that it was prescient, but on the other hand feel, well, no, actually it doesn't have all the details right? Does it somehow lessen that as a work of fiction?
I don't think so, but I think it's a personal choice to go back and to realize that when you read a book, you're almost invoking a time machine because you're looking at someone else's thoughts and ideas and dreams 50 or 100 years ago. And so if you want to understand what people thought the world would be like then versus what we have now, it's a great way to do a comparison. And sometimes you think, wow, we're in a lot better place because we have the measles vaccine. And other times you say, international cooperation isn't really as good as it could be, and the planet could be better in some ways because of it.
Quite often you will see in science fiction from the 1930s and the 1940s, they will be writing about world governments and the world president and that kind of thing. And of course, in reality, we've never been able to achieve anything remotely close to that. We have the United Nations, but the reputation of the United Nations has never been that of a kind of a world-leading organisation. It's sometimes cast as being an irrelevance or something that governments would rather not have. So some of those dreams of science fiction, which sound perfect, just don't happen in real life.
I guess that's the advantage of fiction, is you can imagine something that you consider perfect and then build a world around it.
Yeah. Now, when you suggested X science fiction, I started thinking about different ways that science fiction might become non-scientific. And to me, that would be partly because science has moved on, so things that we used to believe were true are no longer true. Mm-hmm. Another thought that occurred to me is that sometimes the technology shown in science fiction just seems so antiquated when the real world moves beyond it. And to me, the classic is Jules Verne. And I actually went and looked at 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, because in my mind, I had this memory that in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the Nautilus submarine, I had it in my mind that it was driven by electricity, but that Verne never said where the electricity came from. So I went and looked at the book just to see if my recollection was correct, and in fact I was wrong. He does say where the electricity comes from, but where it comes from is from the salts in the ocean, and for all I know, this is plausible. You sort of extract the right chemicals from the ocean, and you can use those to somehow generate electricity from batteries. But when you look at the detail of how he describes different parts of the submarine connecting to each other, you do see a kind of technological naivety. And I wrote down some notes here. He talks about the propeller of the submarine being, quote, in communication by an electric thread to the dial on the bridge so that you could see how fast the engine was turning. Now, that's not a million miles away from what we've traditionally done in cars. You know, the engine in a car turns, the wheels turn, that drives a cable that turns the speedometer. But of course, those traditionally were not electrical. That was a mechanical linkage. And what I found interesting, and this may just be the translation, but the interesting thing is that Verne doesn't talk about communication by a wire, as we would say. You know, the signal comes along a wire. He talks about an electric thread, which sounds very physical to me, rather than electrical or electronic. Although, as I say, it could just be the translation from the French was poor. And of course, in From the Earth to the Moon, he fires people off to the moon not in a rocket, but by putting them in a projectile which goes into a giant cannon and then shoots them off into space. And if you did that, the G-forces would just flatten you like a pancake. So that wouldn't at all work, and probably was implausible at the time, but it certainly seems implausible now.
It might have been familiar to people who had gone to a circus and seen the human cannonball.
Yes, and that's the mental image that I have as well. But you're absolutely right. But he also talks about gun clubs being involved in the development of this giant cannon, and that just seems really weird to me. I mean, to me, you needed to get people like Wernher von Braun, who were rocket experts, to invent a whole new technology. But he sort of draws upon the known technology of the time. So it's reasonable extrapolation in a sense, but from today's perspective looking back, it just seems totally ridiculous and implausible.
Yes.
And then I thought about instances where science fiction tries to do something speculative but ends up creating something that is so totally ridiculous. And the example I've got here is a Robert Heinlein story called The Roads Must Roll. And this one, I don't know if you know this one, but the basic premise is that we will move about our cities on conveyor belts. So rather than walk along a sidewalk, and rather than drive, we would step onto a conveyor belt, and that would carry us along the street. And if we wanted to go faster, well, we would step across to the right onto a faster conveyor belt. And the faster you want to travel, the more conveyor belts you have to cross till you get to the one that's travelling at the speed you want to go at. So in this story, it's like the whole city is full of these conveyor belts. And of course, something goes dreadfully wrong, as it would, because that's so overly complicated. But what I find interesting is to compare that with the reality of where we are now. We do have conveyor belts for people, we have escalators, and in airports you have those, I don't know what they're technically called, I call them travelators. It's like a flat escalator. You step onto it with your suitcase and it carries you along at twice walking speed. But those, when we have those in airports, they're maybe 100 metres long at most, and then you get off. Because the people who build them recognise that you can't make these things infinitely long. You have to do it in sections. So when we compare the imagined idea of Heinlein with what is realistically practical with a technology, we end up with something that is so vastly different. And to me, the Heinlein story just seems ludicrous when I read it today. Although I recognise that's not what the story is really about. It's really about how societies become dependent on a complicated infrastructure, and that's a bad thing. So the message of the story is still valid. It's just the technology is just so bizarre. And I think, to me, that's when science fiction becomes ex-science fiction. It's when the speculations just become so divorced from anything we would actually want to do that it just becomes laughable when you look back on it.
Yeah, particularly in movies, we talk about suspension of disbelief. Mm-hmm. And I think that still holds when we read too. If there are too many things which take you out of that zone, it just doesn't work anymore.
But of course, you can read these, as you said earlier, you can read these as examples of their time. So you can enjoy looking back at these things as, I suppose, whimsical explorations of ideas, even though they are not practical in any modern sense. And I think that's probably the explanation for steampunk. It's anachronistic. We enjoy the anachronism of sort of dressing up in Victorian costume and pretending that everything is driven by steam. And I've said before, I'm sure, that some writers avoid talking about the details of technology, and their stories are able to hold up over time, whereas others really dig down into the details and then end up looking a bit antiquated when you look back. So someone like Bradbury, with his short story The Veldt, which is a kind of a virtual reality room that people go into, you can reread that story today, and there are little bits of technology in there that do sound ridiculous. He talks about film strips, for instance, being the mechanism behind The Veldt. But most of the story is not at all about the technology, and so the story still holds up. Whereas in the hands of someone like Heinlein, he would have felt the need to give you a plausible explanation of the whole infrastructure of how these things work. And reading the story now, we would say, oh, that's ridiculous, that just doesn't work. I think that may happen with some of Arthur C. Clarke's as well, except that Clarke often has somehow a greater insight about how the world works. I think he goes into the nuts and bolts, but he usually has some insight that nobody else had, like the idea that governments would have to club together to be able to send people into space and that kind of thing.
Well, and he's, as most of our listeners know, he's known as the inventor of the communication satellite.
Yeah. So he had real qualifications. Let's do our regular quick run-through of past, present and future. So the past, one of our regular little features here is to talk about old science fiction. Now, I know we do that all the way through the podcast anyway, but particularly highlighting classics that need a wider audience or things that need to be brought back to public attention. Colin, have you got any past recommendations this time?
Oh, I've mentioned several things I've read in the past, but I would recommend that people go read some old Arthur C. Clarke to look at what it was like when a lot of people in the world dreamed about going into space. Those were wonderful dreams, and we can still have them.
Yeah, absolutely. I've not been reading an old science fiction book, but I have been reading an old science fiction writer. I've been looking again at the writer L. Sprague de Camp, which is probably the most magnificent name an author ever had. And his first name was Lion, but he always abbreviated it to L for some reason, just the letter L. Now, I'd read some of him back in the day, and I don't think he is particularly well remembered right now in 2021, but he was still winning awards and honours in the 1990s, so it's, within living memory. And there was a time, really, when I think he was considered to be in the same league as Asimov and Clarke and Heinlein and those sort of people. He's from that same generation. Had a similar mindset to those authors in sort of in terms of scientific accuracy and that kind of thing. Highly prolific science fiction writer and fantasy writer and non-fiction writer. And I haven't counted up how many books he wrote, but I think he's probably getting pretty close to the amount that Asimov wrote. And certainly the breadth of what he wrote about is probably comparable to Asimov. I've been reading a non-fiction book by L. Sprague de Camp, which is The Great Monkey Trial, which is just a historical account of the old Scopes monkey trial, the 1920s, when a teacher was prosecuted for teaching evolution in the classroom. Right. It's a really detailed book. He's clearly done the research, probably goes into far too much detail for the average reader. I think I've got about halfway through the book now, and the trial hasn't yet begun, because he spends all the time establishing who all of the players are in the story, all of the social history and religious history and scientific history that got us to the point where a teacher is put on trial for teaching evolution. And then we'll go into the trial. That hasn't happened yet in the book as I'm reading it, but it's a very meticulously researched piece of work. When I was reading that, I started thinking about the science fiction of his that I had read, and probably his most well-known story is one called A Gun for Dinosaur, which is one of these let's go back in time and hunt dinosaurs stories. That story, I read that years and years ago, quite liked it. What I didn't know is that sometime in the 1990s, I think it was, he put that together with some of his other time travel stories and put them out as a book, which is called Rivers of Time. So that's another book that I've just added to my pile of things to read, is Rivers of Time by L. Sprague de Camp. And I've no idea if that's how you pronounce his name. I've only ever seen it written down. But yeah, I recommend people go and seek out these old-timers and check out their fiction and their non-fiction as well.
I agree.
The other thing from the past is that I realised a couple of weeks ago that somehow I've never seen the 1951 film The Man from Planet X. So I bought the DVD and I'm going to watch that.
As someone that teaches media, is there something in particular you're looking for, or is this more of a science fiction fan's approach to it, where you're saying, I want everything on the list from that time period?
Yeah, it's that. It's just the thought. I used to think of myself as being a completist when it came to science fiction media. I've got loads of reference books, and I thought I had seen all of the significant films, and I realised that Man from Planet X was being talked about in a lot of books, but I'd never actually seen it. And I think it's because it didn't get shown very often on British television, unlike things like Destination Moon, The Day the Earth Stood Still, Forbidden Planet. All of those were constantly shown on TV when I was growing up, but I don't remember ever seeing The Man from Planet X. I think the rights to it must have been held by a different company, and so it didn't get distributed in the same way. What about the present? Are you reading or watching or listening to any current science fiction?
The Map of Tiny Perfect Things by Lev Grossman. It is a wonderful... a lot of science fiction tends toward the dark, but this is a love story augmented by a time loop. It's wonderful, it's delightful, it's funny, it's touching, it's moving, it's lighthearted. It was a great thing to make for this time in human history, for me particularly. So it's a great short story, and if you buy the ebook copy of it, which is available because it's been published in a couple of anthologies, if you buy the standalone ebook, it has a 15 to 20 page addendum at the end by Lev Grossman talking about how the story came to be and the process of adapting it and finding a distribution house and producer.
Fantastic. I don't have a lot to report under present because I've been mostly looking at old stuff this last couple of weeks, but I did resolve that I was going to watch The Stowaway because I've seen quite a few reviews of it. I've seen some that say that it's really very good, and I've seen some that say it is terrible. And it's one of those where I thought, I really have to see this and make up my own mind, so I'm going to watch that. Have you seen it?
I haven't. Well, after you watch The Stowaway, I would suggest that you find Scott Manley's YouTube channel.
Oh,
he was a science advisor. Do you know Scott?
Not personally, but I do look at those occasionally.
So he was an advisor to the movie and talks about it in several of his more recent episodes.
Ah, fantastic. What about the future? What science fiction are you looking forward to seeing or reading or hearing in the next year or so?
I am anxiously waiting for that email from Powell's to get my copy of Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. But I heard that another one of my favorite authors, Mary Robinette Cole, she's making a children's book called Molly on the Moon. And the idea of someone who writes such a huge breadth of fantasy and science fiction making a children's book just is very intriguing to me. So I want to see how that works and what it ends up being.
You do see that occasionally, sort of big name authors going into the children's market, and I usually assume that large amounts of money have changed hands, but we'll see. I saw some interesting news this week, which is that John Wyndham's The Midwich Cuckoos is being filmed again. And what came to my attention particularly was the casting details, which has been published. It's going to be, I think, an 8-part miniseries, and it's going to star 2 British actors, Keeley Hawes and Max Beasley, both of whom are quite well known here. I don't know if they're very well known anywhere else. The script is by a good writer, somebody who's won awards in the past, so that's promising. And the thing that's probably the most promising of all is that none of the publicity materials mentions any of the previous adaptations. So they're not pitching this as a remake of Village of the Damned. They're pitching this as an adaptation of The Midwich Cuckoos, and that pleases me immensely. So I look forward to seeing that.
Well, and hopefully doing it as a miniseries will allow them to bring in some of the things you would lose in a short 2-hour adaptation.
Yes, hopefully, yeah. Well, I think we've pretty much come to the end of our allotted time, so I'll finish by playing a reminder of our mystery sound. So here it is again. So there's our mystery sound for this week. If you want to have a guess, please go to our website, 101sf.blogspot.com, and post a comment, or you can find us on Facebook. So, thank you, Colin. We've made it to the end of episode 4.
Right on.
So, thanks for listening, folks. Hope you'll join us for our next one. We're Phil Nichols and Colin Kuskie. Our theme tune is from purpleplanet.com. Look for the show notes on our website, 101sf.blogspot.com, and also find us as Science Fiction 101 on Facebook. And finally, please subscribe wherever you find us, and maybe give us a 5-star review. I hear those are very good. You can find us all sorts of places. We're on Anchor FM, we're on Podtail, we're on Spotify. We're wherever you get your podcasts. So please seek us out, subscribe, and give us a review or a rating. Thanks for listening. See you next time.